Hey there, it's Jason from Codemanship with a video about specification by example for Python developers. So in a previous video, I asked the question, what tests should we write when we're doing test-driven development? And we came to the conclusion that the tests should be meaningful. In other words, they should be about outcomes that our users or our customers want. And I introduced you to a practice or a pattern that's described in Ken Beck's book, Test-Driven Development by Example, called a test list. So I used the example of a CD warehouse, and we had some pretty vague requirements. There's our vague requirements there from our customer. And what we did was we went through that and we sort of parsed those requirements, identified the key use cases, buy a CD, search for a CD, etc. And for each of those use cases, we thought about the different test scenarios that our software might need to handle. So for example, for buying a CD, the happy path is that it's in stock, or maybe it's out of stock. So we might need to write a test for what happens when that's true. We might also need to write a test for how to handle when their credit card payment is rejected. So that's all very useful and a great way of sort of fleshing out a roadmap for the test that you think you will need to write in order to give your customer what they're asking for. But it's still very much open to interpretation. Exactly what is supposed to happen when we buy a CD, exactly what is supposed to happen when the payment is rejected, and so on and so forth. So there's still a lot of room for misunderstandings here. And misunderstandings can be very, very expensive. They're often referred to in traditional software engineering as requirements bugs or requirements defects. In other words, misunderstandings about the requirements. And a very expensive way to find out what the customer really meant is to build it, deliver it to them and go, is that what you asked for? There are cheaper and more effective ways of driving a design and getting that feedback from the customer before we've written any code. So one way that we can drive out the details is to use examples. So we can sit down with our customer. Let's say, for example, that we've picked up this particular use case or user story here. We can go find the person who asked for that feature or for that change, and we take them to a quiet place or a meeting room, or somewhere that we can have a proper conversation with them. And we drive out the details by agreeing examples of exactly what they're expecting to happen in terms of inputs and expected outputs or expected outcomes for each of these scenarios, and maybe discover new scenarios that we hadn't thought of as well. So it is a very, very, very valuable process and a very powerful way of directly driving the design of our software in a test-driven way, because another word for an example is a test, as we'll see. With a direct collaboration, a direct conversation with our customer, at the end of which we both walk away with precisely the same shared understanding of exactly what the software is going to do. So what I've done is, for buying a CD, I've sat down with my customer and we've captured these scenarios in a spreadsheet. So I'll just quickly take you through the format I'm using here. Don't get too bogged down in the format. First of all, that's the name of the user story that we're talking about. And I've adopted a convention here where each user story gets its own workbook, and each scenario gets its own worksheet. And you'll see that I've labeled the worksheets with the names of the scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a second. And then what we've done is we've worked with our customer to capture, in a nice, friendly, sort of natural language way, exactly how we think, or how our customer sees this particular scenario working. Now, this is a very popular format these days, very closely associated with a practice called behavior-driven development. Behavior-driven development is just another name for specification by example, so don't worry too much about that. And we capture it in this format called given, when, then. The given, don't worry too much about this. The given is just the setup for that particular test case. The when is the action. And the then is the assertions at the end, the questions that would convince us and our customers that the action has actually worked in that particular scenario. So it's just another format for example, arrange, act, assert that we looked at in much earlier videos. It's just every test has a setup, every test has an action, and every test has assertion. So that's all it is. So we sit down and we write this with them. So given a CD that's not in the top 100, we will talk about that in a second, and we have it in stock, and the customer's card payment will be accepted, When the customer buys that CD, 1 copy is deducted from CD stock. The customer's card is charged our price for that CD, and the charts are notified of the sale. So there's a bunch of details here that were not discussed before. And that's the power of having this conversation with the customer, and getting together with them. The first thing that was not discussed is the charts. Every time we make a sale, we need to tell the charts that we've sold so many copies of a particular album, so they can collate that information. And we've added another detail here. It turns out that our customer has a price guarantee policy for chart albums, albums that are in the top 100. If the album is in the top 100, we check to see what the lowest price out there among our competitors is, and then we guarantee to beat that price by £1. Now, in this particular scenario, that's not a problem, but we need to specify that it's not a problem because it's outside of the top 100. So this is the power of this technique. We've had a conversation with a customer and we've shown them an example and they've gone, okay, what about the price guarantee? So we added another scenario for albums that are in the top 100. We've got a couple of examples of this one. And a similar kind of format. So the name of the user story, it's buy a CD. A different name for the scenario. You'll see that it matches there on the name of the worksheet. There's a new description of the test here. What's different about this? And then we've got 2 examples. And the examples really are where the rubber meets the road. It's the examples, the test data, that makes these tests precise and unambiguous. We would refer to these as potentially executable tests. In other words, we can actually write a test using this data and see whether or not our software design really does do exactly what they're expecting. That should actually say output. I made a little boo-boo there. So let's take a look at the format of this test data. So we've got a bunch of inputs. That's the setup for our test, if you like. Oh, no, that's not. That's wrong. That should be there. So we've got a bunch of inputs there, and then we've got these expected outputs. So these, essentially what we're doing with each of these columns is we're filling in the blanks in this description. So what CD? What is its chart position? How much stock have we got? What is the customer's card? And so on and so forth. So we're filling in the gaps here, essentially. So if you think of these test description here as defining a bunch of test variables, we're populating those variables using examples. So there's no room for misunderstandings now. It's going to do exactly this in this particular test case. So it's one step ahead of just having a test list. And we're actually really pinning down the meaning of each of those scenarios and building a precise shared understanding between us and our customers, and not just between us and our customers. There are other people that would find this, these test examples very, very useful. For example, user experience designers now have something very concrete to go on. So they should probably be involved, if not in the meeting, they should at least be involved in this process in terms of maybe driving their designs, for example, wireframes or screen flows directly from this kind of data. So there are all sorts of people who might need to know this stuff. So these are jolly useful, not just for the internal software design process, but for UI design and for security issues. A security person involved in this process might think, oh, hang on a minute, credit card numbers, ooh, let's have a talk about that. So there are also all kinds of people who would find these tests, these examples very, very useful. But let's talk about what developers will do with them. So we've agreed a test, we've done it in a spreadsheet. And what I could do is I could literally start writing unit tests using this data. So what I've done, just to make a start on this, is I've actually written, here we got it here, a unit test. And you'll see I've adopted, again, don't get too hung up on the convention that I've adopted here. The important thing is that your convention makes sense to you and to everyone else involved who needs to read the code. But I've adopted a convention here where in my test package here, I've got sub-packages for each of these user stories. And there may be multiple test fixtures, and there's one test fixture for each of the scenarios. And as we scroll down here, we can see I've kind of commented here just to make it obvious what's going on. Given, so this is the setup basically. And what I've done is I've literally copied and pasted the data from our test into the unit test. So we've got the album information, we've got the price, we've got the credit card details and so on. We've got there whether or not the payment is accepted, what the chart position is. These are mock objects, or in this case, they're really stubs. So they're returning hard-coded test data because we're going to fake these until we make them. We're just at the moment concerned about the logic of buying a CD. We're not concerned about how payments are processed or how we get information from the charts. So we're using test doubles for that, as you will have seen in the video about working outside in with test doubles. So we're all in very familiar territory here. This is just TDD, the way that you've been doing it. It's just now the question is, where are the tests coming from and where is the test data coming from? The answer is from the customer. That's what we mean by meaningful tests. So we populate all of this. Then there's the when part. So there's the action specified. That's where we're actually executing the buy. And then finally, we've got one assertion. Remember, it's a good rule of thumb that each test should only ask one question, only have one reason to fail. So rather than just having one test method that has all three assertions about whether or not one copy is deducted from the stock, whether or not the customer's card is charged the right price, whether or not the charts are notified of the sale, what I've done is I've set up one test method for each of those using the name of the test methods essentially are taken directly from these assertions here. So it's all very closely matching. We know what we're talking about here. It's standard unit tests. These aren't system tests or integration tests. The external dependencies have been stubbed or mocked. So it's TDD as you know it. It's just the question, the big question, the million-dollar question is, where did the tests come from and where does the test data come from? So I've followed that convention there, and I've got one test for each of those outcomes. If, as is the case with one of our other test scenarios here, for albums that are in the top 100 where our price guarantee applies, we've got two tests for this. And you might be thinking, well, would we create two fixtures? No, we could very simply just turn this into a parameterized test and just supply that test data as parameter values. So again, a direct reflection of what we agreed with the customer. Once we've got this working, we then might start working our way into the core stack and writing tests for the thing that actually handles the payments and tests for the thing that actually gets information from the charts. So again, working outside in, we sort of work through the layers in our architecture, writing tests at each of those layers at a fairly high granular level, so they're not super duper fine unit tests. A lot of people refer to these as functional tests to distinguish from having tests for individual methods. In this case, it is a test for an individual method, but it is an individual method that involves a bunch of stuff happening, for which there may be separate tests because then we would consider those to be separate concerns. So there you go, that's specification by example. And the effect, if this is done well, is that you cut out a lot of the misunderstandings, ideally all of them, but certainly most of them, the misunderstandings, the requirements defects, and you save yourself a lot of time downstream from having to fix those requirements defects, having to clear up those misunderstandings by rewriting the software, by being able to fix those misunderstandings in the room in front of, for example, in a spreadsheet. Now, don't get too hung up on the tools or the formats or the conventions. That's not what specification by example is all about. The most important thing is who you have that conversation with. It needs to be with your customer, the person who wants that feature. And they need to be providing the examples, ideally from the real world, so it's as realistic as possible. And that conversation is so very important. Some teams get hung up on the tools. So there are tools you can get that are designed for capturing customer examples. Cucumber for behavior-driven development, for example, is very popular. And I think these tools are great because they can, I'm copying and pasting data in, and that's a bit of a pain in the, you know what. So these tools help to sort of speed up and streamline that whole process. But don't get hung up on the tools. Just because you're using something like Cucumber doesn't mean that you're doing specification by example. What that means is that you are working directly with your customers and capturing examples of exactly how the software should work in each of these scenarios before you start writing code. So you're agreeing tests with your customer. That's the most important thing. Copying and pasting things into code is not that big a deal, if we're being honest. It's not a huge problem. So if you're not familiar with these tools and if your customer is more comfortable using spreadsheets, or however they want to do it, if they want to do it on a blackboard, it is useful that you can capture these examples in particular in a format that is easily machine readable. Because as I've done many times in VBA, for example, for Excel, it's quite straightforward to write code that automatically generates. If you imagine we could write an Excel macro where we say, well, look, there's the data, there's our examples, and that would automatically generate unit tests or the skeleton of unit tests that we can then start populating with real code. So it is useful and probably important that at the very least we're capturing our examples in a format that is both customer friendly and potentially machine readable. At the very least, easily copy and pastable, if that's a phrase. And we tend to find that the amount of time that we save downstream, because in most projects, requirements misunderstandings account for a very large part of the amount of bug fixing that goes on. So much time spent fixing those bugs after the fact, after we've delivered the software, that the time that we invest sitting down with our customer and agreeing these tests up front and driving out those misunderstandings up front, in other words, shifting that whole process, that whole feedback process forward to the front end of our development cycle, can save enormous amounts of time. It can save enormous amounts of time. Now, the reason that most development teams who claim to be doing specification by example or behavior-driven development or acceptance test-driven development or whatever they're calling it, the reason why most of those teams are actually writing the tests themselves and not the customer or not with the customer is because the customer is not willing to invest that time. They will not engage, because this does take up quite a lot of your customer's time. And they will see that as an imposition, but you need to give them a choice here. They can either invest the time in this process, in specification by example, or they can invest a lot more time and money, developers' time and their money, in fixing those misunderstandings after we've delivered the software. And on average, the cost of doing that is orders of magnitude higher. They'll spend, or rather they'll waste a lot more money doing it that way. So give them a choice as to where they would like to spend their money. Would they like to spend their money on this, or would they like to spend their money fixing all of those requirements, misunderstandings, at many times the price when the software has been delivered? So there you go, that's specification by example. It is, again, as with all test-driven development, it's about design, it's not about testing. And again, a lot of teams get very hung up on these specs, and they want to preserve them and maintain them and etc., etc. Don't get hung up on that. Once you've delivered it, and the code does what it does. And if you've written your tests so that they are driven directly by that conversation you had with your customer, you now have a test that essentially codifies, encapsulates the logic of what the customer was asking for. So you end up essentially with fast running, in inverted commas, unit tests or developer tests. And that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming to drive out a simple design, a clean design, and leave ourselves with fast-running tests. And those tests should be asking all of the questions that the customer wants asked. And that's the most important thing. These things, I tend to archive them. Like all documentation, it very quickly gets out of step. People will say, well, if you have a direct link between the way that you've captured the examples and the executable test, that's good. But you need to be very careful about that, because some of these tools are smart, and what they will do is they will generate these kinds of tests for you, so you end up with potentially with fast-running unit tests. But some of these tools, not so much. Some of these tools are reading the data every time you run the tests, and that means that they're going to run slow. So if they're reading data from spreadsheets or from wiki pages, in the case of a tool called Fitness, those tests are going to run slow. And if you end up with thousands and thousands of those, your test pyramid, we're going to talk about that in a future video, is going to be upside down. In other words, the bulk of your tests are going to be slow running. And that's going to slow down your build cycles, which is going to slow down the pace of delivery, which is going to slow down everything. But we'll talk about that in a future video. So your goal is to end up with code that does what the customer asked for, So we build that shared understanding and we test that understanding in the room using examples. And we also want to end up with tests that ask all of those questions and run fast. When the customer wants to change the behavior, that essentially is a new ticket. That's a new requirement. So we go through the process again. We agree new tests. Do not get hung up on maintaining your specs. We're trying to deliver working software here. And ultimately, if you want to know what the code does, go look at the software and see what it does when you click those buttons. So there you go, specification by example, a very powerful technique. I will recommend a book at this point. It's called Specification by Example by Gojko Adzik. I will post a link in the description below, along with a link to the source files on GitHub. This is quite a wide topic. It takes some getting used to because you are working directly with your customer, and a lot of teams do not have that privilege. But it's well worth fighting for, believe me.